Hello and welcome to Lolo's List of Small Delights, a series of videos where I share the small delights I've discovered in my life, which has been bringing me a lot of joy, especially during these crazy times of COVID lockdown. And I hope that maybe you would like to turn them into your small delights as well. But before we start, I would like to just spend some time to thank everyone who has supported the channel. And I am, of course, talking about my friends, family, and the Dwarf Fortress community. Thanks so much for those of you who have watched, commented, and liked the video. I had so much fun reading those comments. They are so kind. And for those who subscribe to the channel, yes, it is my very intention to keep making videos for this channel. At the end of this video, I would like to also share a little bit behind the scene and why this video came out a little bit later than I was planning it to be. So, without further ado, let's start this episode of Small Delight. The topic is oysters. Friends, family, and everybody from the Dwarf Fortress community, don't go. I know many of you are not oyster eaters or not interested in oysters, but allow me to share my journey going from not a fan of oysters to being able to truly appreciate this gift of the sea. Some of you might be wondering what oyster has to do with Dwarf Fortress. Not a lot actually, but if they were to have one thing in common, that would be, in spite of the initial high barrier to entry, once you got into it, you never regret it. So, with all that said, let's dive into the world of oysters. Having been estimated as 300 million years old, oysters are perhaps one of the oldest superfoods around, and people have caught on eating oysters for a long time too. Archaeologists found oyster beds in prehistoric kitchen middens dated 10,000 years ago. The proper cultivation of oysters can be traced back to as early as 100 BC to this guy, Sergius Orata, an ancient Rome merchant, inventor, hydraulic engineer. Being a crafty individual, Orata wanted to take advantage of the wealthy Romans' liking for shellfish as food. So he developed many new techniques for breeding oysters. Consumed by both rich and poor, the oyster has inspired writers, poets, painters, and even lovers. Casanova was said to have started each day with a breakfast of 50 oysters. Oyster shells have been found by archaeologists in sites that are associated with procreation, symbolic of birth and the womb. The painting Birth of Venus, aka the god of love, Aphrodite, also depict the goddess to be born from a sea foam out of a piece of oyster shell. Scientifically speaking, few other foods can compare with the nutritional value of oysters. The oyster is a well-balanced, easily digestible and nutritious food, rich in minerals and vitamins. Oyster is rich in zinc, which is known to aid immunity and promote wound healing. Aphrodisiac or not, oysters earned its status as a superfood. Based on my expert observation, an oyster eater's journey can be divided into 3 stages, and I have personally gone through all 3 stages and landed on 3. My earliest memory of eating an oyster took place approximately when I was around 10 years old. I recall that one particular summer, my mom acquired a taste of eating oysters, and she would put a large amount of ketchup on her oyster and slurp it all down. Retrospectively speaking, controversial choice. But like any good mom, she asked me to try some, and I did. To this day, I could still recall the shock I felt as this strange, cold, alien-y texture sliding down my throat. And the first reaction would be, what was that? I don't know. This is not for me. few years later, she did the same thing to me by introducing me to durian. For those of you who don't know what durian is, just look at the reaction Gordon boy here has towards it. And to all that, I want to say thank you, Mom, for introducing those strange but ultimately delightful fruits into my life. Fast forward a few years, I'm all grown up, and I find myself to enjoy oyster a bit more than when I was a kid. Usually in the summer, with great company of friends and family, and in an atmospheric restaurant. When I was living in London, in the West End, there are a few very old traditional seafood restaurants, so established that people were calling them institutions. It was a nice feeling to, occasionally put on a nice dress, treat yourself to a nice plate of oysters, and taking the nice smell of fresh seawater and be transformed into a seaside town that is far away from the business of the big city. Did I love the taste of oyster then? Not nearly as much as I do now. Did I know that summer was not the best time to be eating oysters? Absolutely not. But even then, oysters still brought me some small delights. If you fall into the second stage, where you occasionally enjoy a good oyster in a fancy restaurant with good company, that's so great, as the third stage is not for the faint-hearted. Stage 3 is when you find yourself owning not one, not two, but 3 oyster knives. You stop going to fancy restaurants to eat oysters and start to look for oysters in your local fishmonger and start heckling with them on the price. Start to appreciate more the real taste of oysters than what it might represent. So much so that you find yourself wading through knee-high water for 2 hours to drag buckets of oyster back home and shuck them yourself for another hour or so. When my mom came to visit me over Christmas, I gifted her a tour of Oyster Safari at Wadden Sea National Park. Wadden Sea National Park is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the few locations in Denmark where people can take a guided tour to visit wild oyster beds and pick as many oysters as they would like to bring home. Remembered how much she liked oysters when I was a kid, I thought it would be a grand adventure. We get to the park early and received a nice presentation on the history and the current state of the wild oysters in the Wadden Sea area. 2 types of oysters live in the Wadden Sea National Park area. One type is its native European flat oysters, and it is also called lingfong oysters here in Denmark. This type of oyster has been in serious decline population in the past 100 years. In the 1940s, it almost went extinct. Lingfong area in Denmark currently has the last surviving natural population of European flat oysters. It is very slowly to grow, and it's very sensitive towards the change in sea temperature. It would just stop breeding if the temperature fluctuates a little bit too much. On the other hand, we also have the Pacific oysters in the park. They are the most tough and easy to survive breed of oysters. That's also why this is currently the most traded and breeded oyster around the world. France has imported it from Japan, specifically in the 1960s, and it came to rest of Europe throughout the 20th century. And in the 1990s, the Wadden Sea National Park imported this type of oysters, and ever since its arrival, its population has exploded exponentially, as that it's not as susceptible to disease as the European flat oysters, and also breeds in spite of the sea temperature fluctuation. So this is the type of oyster that we would be picking during the oyster safari. And if you were to be eating oysters, pick these type of oysters. They are considered as invasive species currently in the park and in many parts of the world, as they attach themselves to shellfish fish such as blue mussels and makes food not so as readily available for other animals and marine life in the environment. Having learned some knowledge, we geared up in waders, as during the trek, the water could go up to as high as your knees. After hours of trek, finally, we arrived at the destination, a huge oyster reef. Essentially, it is a sizable island made out of oysters, kind of like the witch's house made out of candies in Hansel and Gretel story. Indeed, an oyster lover's paradise. Look at that shitty grin on my face. The Oyster Safari is not an easy trip, but I think many would find the experience worthy, even if you don't love eating oysters as much as I do. During the hour-long trek, our guide gave introductions on the ecosystem in the Wadden Sea Park, introducing us to all types of marine life that lives there. The national park is also famous for its black sun, a phenomenon observed during birds' migration. All in all, it's a fun experience close in nature. If you're going to visit Wadden Sea National Park after the pandemic, do remember to drop by the city of Ribe, which is only a short drive away. It is one of the oldest cities in Denmark, with streets and squares perfectly preserved, looking exactly like how they were hundreds of years ago. Okay, here we have a case of my favorite oyster. Trust me, this does not happen often. A friend of mine, Lars, who hooked me up with a local oyster wholesaler, so I get to have these at a wholesale price. Otherwise, I don't think I could afford it. So thanks, Lars. Thanks for feeding me. Okay. Yep, that's a lot of oysters. Don't eat oysters, the dead oysters that would be automatically open. I have a bad case of diarrhea. I have a bad case of diarrhea. And when they're alive, they are close dead because they have this muscle that holding their shells together. So how to store this? If you couldn't eat them all at once, you have them at home. Do not put them on ice because these ice would melt in the fridge, and just don't make sure that the oysters are not submerged in the melted ice, because then they would filter in these melted ice water, and they would be running out of oxygen, and that's how they could die, because there's no oxygen in the water that's coming from the ice. Okay, before you open any oysters or shuck any oysters, always remember to wear a pair of gloves. We got these super professional oyster gloves when we went on the Oyster Safari at the Wadden Sea National Park in Denmark. But they are like, you know, any gloves that are gardening gloves that you use to work, that is fine, because the oyster shell is very sharp, and the knife itself, it takes quite a lot of strength to actually open an oyster. Niels usually does it for me, like this one here. It's not complicated, but it's definitely not effortless. So use your oyster knife, and there are different ways of doing it. I think the more sophisticated or the French way, they will start from the top, but the easier way, I think, for beginners is to start from the back, where you see there's a pointy end here, and you just really want to I could already feel like this is gonna be a battle. Just nudge it in. So hard. And you want it to really firmly lodged into the shell, front and back. Yep. And oops. Yeah, it's in. And then you want to run the knife through the top of the oyster so that you sever the muscle that connects to shells.
moments later.
Okay, here we have it. And then you want to then just detach the oyster from the bottom shell.
More moments later.
And then it is loose. And you're ready to go. Okay.
The mellow flavor of it envelops my heart, like the gentle breeze of the highlands in springtime.
So, the key to eating oysters is that you really need to give it a proper chew. Really bite through it. Don't just swallow it, because then you're not gonna get to the umami, like the sweetness of the muscly part that is close to here, to this part that is working super hard to close the bill together. Yummy. Yeah, that's it. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks so much, and hope you learned a little bit more about oysters. Happiness is not real unless shared. In spite of the pandemic, I was lucky enough to be sharing the oysters with a small and intimate group of friends and family. Besides eating the oysters raw with lemon the old-fashioned way, I also customized and tried out a new grilled oyster recipe with some butter, Korean fermented chili paste, and bacon. Is it good?
This is really good. Yes?
Is it better than eating it raw?
I think it adds something. Yeah, definitely does.
If you're interested in this recipe, leave me a comment. I will write it up for you. Thanks everyone who watched to the end. I know it's kind of a strange topic to be coming out on a video, especially if you are expecting another video game related topics. But you know, this is Lolo's list of small delights. Anything goes. Either way, I hope you enjoyed watching the bizarre adventure of me and oysters. Leave me a comment below and let me know, have you had oysters before? Did you like it? Did you hate it? If you hated it, would you give it a second chance now that you know more about it? The video took longer than expected to make, as I'm still figuring out a working workflow for making videos. And I paid a lot of attention on selecting the music for this video. Also, as you might have noticed, that I tried a million different type of technique in this episode. We'll have some unboxing videos, some food reaction, some how-to tutorials, and just some explanation videos. Oh, also a travel vlog. I'm thinking about making a separate behind-the-scene video to share some of the thoughts I have on building the channel and maybe answer a few questions that I've received in the comments about the channel. So yeah, subscribe and get a notification to know when that one would come out. I'll work hard on it. Thanks again. Please share the video with people you care about if you think this is fun, and I will see you soon.